Welcome to episode 3 of the Code Breakdown. This episode I'm going to cover the basics of RSpec, and I'm going to pick up kind of where we left off in episode 2. Now, if you recall in episode 2, we implemented a list screencast feature using Cucumber, and partway through I mentioned that I would normally have dropped down to RSpec, but avoided doing so because I wanted to stay focused on Cucumber. Now, normally you drop down to RSpec because that is actually the BDD process, given that the BDD is an outside-in process. So this lesson is going to be picking up exactly where I mentioned I would normally drop down to RSpec in the last one. So if we rerun our Cucumber tests, we should see that the index action is missing, and that is the point at which I would normally drop down from a Cucumber test into an RSpec test for that controller. So if we go look at the screencast controller, we can see that this is the default generated controller from the Rails generation command that we ran to generate our controller in episode 2. So we can also see that there are no methods inside of this controller that are defined. So if we look at the generated RSpec file, we can see that there's this require spec helper that is actually required for controller tests because it loads the Rails stack. It also loads some RSpec configuration settings. You actually don't need this in lib tests, and it can drastically improve performance if you don't add it to your lib tests. But if you're willing to take the performance hit, then it's not a big deal and you can have it there. It shouldn't cause any problems. If we go down here, we can see that the first thing we see in this generated RSpec file is that it has a describe block and it's passing the class screencast controller to that describe block. Now, RSpec is smart enough to recognize that based on this object that we are inside of a controller test, and based on naming scheme, of course. Because of that, it provides some extra or makes some functionality available to us that wouldn't be available in like a standard lib RSpec test. So the describe command or method in RSpec is probably one of the most commonly used methods. The other one is the it method. And the it method is what we use to describe actual test cases. It's basically used to describe the behavior of the code. So in this case, we have just a index method which we need to add on this, right? So there is somewhat of a standard of actually adding a describe block with the HTTP method that will be hitting it, and then the method name. So in this case, get index, because it's going to be an HTTP get method to the index action. So once we have a describe that tells us which method we're writing tests for, we can actually start to write our its. So in this case, we know that it gets all of the screencasts. All right. We also know that it is going to assign all of these, or the obtained screencasts. And when I say that, it's going to assign the obtained screencast to an instance variable. And the reason we're going to do that is because in order to expose the screencasts to a view, the standard way of doing that in Rails is to assign them to an instance variable, and that instance variable will be available inside of the views. So we also want it to render the screencasts, or the index view template. Okay, so this is usually the process I go through. I create a describe block for the outer container. I create a describe block for the method that I'm working on, or in this case, the action on the controller I'm working on. Then I start thinking about, well, what does that method or what does that action need to do? And start writing in English the behaviors that it's going to need to do with it methods. Now, if we run it at this state of the game, we can see that those 3 tests will show up as pending tests. And you can see here it says screencast controller get index gets all of the screencasts. And we can also see that it assigns the obtained screencast to an instance variable. And you might notice that I neglected to make the second 2 plural, and they should really be plural for readability purposes, so that the sentences read well when you run them and you see them output in RSpec documentation form. So we can see now the sentences make quite a bit more sense. So the its by themselves without a block are defaulted to pending tests. Pending as the same concept that we talked about in Cucumber in episode 2. They're basically tests that are not implemented yet. So let's say we want to start implementing one. We also can mark it as pending by calling the pending method inside of the block. If we run this test now, we can see that that test is once again pending because we used the pending method call inside of it. So let's start implementing this. We know that we wanted to get all of the screencasts. And if you recall from episode 2, we built a catalog module, and inside that catalog module we defined a class level method called all, which returns all of the screencasts. So if we go back to our test, we can know that this, to verify that it gets all the screencasts, what we really should be doing is verifying that the catalog module receives the all method call, and we want to trigger the actual index action on the controller by performing a get request to the index action. So if we run this test now, we'll see what RSpec says. And RSpec yells at me because I misspelled receives, of course. So if we correct the spelling of receives, or actually it's still spelled incorrectly. It is correct in terms of should receive is the method call, not should receives. So now that we got past that, now it's telling us that the index action could not be found on the controller, which is correct because we just saw that it wasn't there. So let's go add it, def index, and then go back and run our test again. So now we're getting a different error. Now we're getting an error telling us that the template for screencast/index cannot be found. And then it's searching up to application index. The reason it's going up to application index is because Rails supports view inheritance. And if we do not specify a screencast index, then it would look for the index view up at the more global level. But in this case, we want a separate screencast index view. We just don't have one. And the reason this is happening is because Rails by default, even if we don't specify inside of the action, it by default tries to render a template with the same name as the method nested under the same directory as the controller name. So since the controller is screencast controller, it's looking inside of screencast/index. So let's actually add the app views screencast index HTML herb file. And let's just save it as an empty file and then go back to our spec test. So now if we run our spec test, we should see a different error. So now we see the error that we want to be seeing. This is the error stating that our catalog module was expecting to receive the all method call, but it did not receive it. So that tells us that we need to go implement the smallest amount of code possible to make that test pass. If we go do that, we go catalog.all, we add that to our index action in our controller, go back and rerun our tests. we should see that test pass, and it does. Okay, so we have one test passing and we have two pending tests. Let's move on to the next test. In this test, we're testing that it assigns the obtained screencast to an instance variable. Okay, in this case, let's start by triggering the action, right? And then let's also set our expectation. Now, RSpec controller tests give you this helper called assigns, which gives you access to the controller's instance variables. So in this case, we can say assigns, and let's say screencasts should equal whatever the screencasts are, right? So this is going to be our expectation. This is saying that the controller, there should be a controller instance variable called screencasts, and it should be equal to whatever we define screencasts to be in our test. So, and what we really want to guarantee is that the screencasts that we obtained from this get all of the screencasts section is what is assigned to this instance variable. So the way we do that is using a technique called stubbing, and we're actually going to create two stubs. We're going to create an object stub, which is going to be screencasts, and to do that, we just assign that variable equal to the method called stub, and you can give stub a string which just is a label describing what that object is, so that when you see failures in RSpec, you can identify what that object represents. So in this case, it represents the screencast collection. Okay, so now that we have this in our test space, we need to find a way to inject that into our running code so that we can verify that the return value of catalog's all method is what is assigned to this instance variable. So the way we do that is using another technique, which is called method stubbing. So we can take catalog, which is our module, and we can stub the all method on that, and we can say and return, and then give it screencast, which is our stub object that we defined right here. So what we're doing with these two lines is we're first creating a stub object that represents our collection of screencasts. We're then stubbing the all method on the catalog module and returning the previous stub object. And the reason we're doing that is to verify that this return value of the all method is what is assigned to the instance variable called screencasts in this controller action. So if we run the test now, we can see that it got down to the expectation of checking that that instance variable, and it's complaining because that instance variable's value is nil, and it's expecting it to be the actual screencasts RSpec stub object that we created before. So that tells us we need to go add our next line of code, and our next line of code is to assign the return value of the catalog all to the screencast variable. So if we do that, go back and run our test, we should see this pass. Nope, it's not passing. So the question now is, why is it not passing? I must have, I didn't pluralize screencasts. So this represents a collection of screencasts, not an individual screencast, therefore it should be plural. And if we go back and run our test, now that I've corrected the spelling of that, we should see this test pass. And it does. Cool. So now we have, if we run all of the tests in this file, we should see two tests passing, the first test and the second test, and we should see a pending test, which is that it renders the index view template. Okay. Now, if you recall, in the first test here, we got the failure that it was missing the index template. And we saw that because Rails was auto rendering it without us explicitly having to put a render call. So we still need to have a test here that covers this. We just need to make sure that we see it fail before we see it pass. So let's start going down this path, and you can see exactly what I mean. In this case, we really want to verify that when we call getIndex, that the response should render template index. Okay? And these also are controllers, kind of special things. The response is a special RSpec controller thing that you normally wouldn't have access to inside of libtests or other things like that. And you normally wouldn't use RSpec matcher like render template in normal tests. You just use those in controller tests. So if we run this, it should pass out of the box, because by default, Rails automatically renders the index action because action template, because the name of the action is index. So if we go, what I said before was we need to see this fail before we see it pass. And the reason we need to do that is because we need to make sure that our test is testing what our code is doing and that that's correct. So to do this, we need to change the actual implementation code to see it fail. We can do that by actually forcing the render to render nothing. And the way you do that in Rails is you do a render and then you pass an option hash with nothing equal to true. So we can run our test again, and then now we should see it fail because it's going to be expecting to render index, but it's really rendering nothing. And we see exactly that failure. So let's flip our code back to the default. And now we can see that it should be passing with the render index template. And if we run all our tests, we should see all three of these tests are passing. Awesome. Great. All three of these are passing. So now that we have all three of our tests passing at the RSpec level that we're down at, the next step would be bouncing back up to the Cucumber test. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we go back to our Cucumber feature here and we run our tests again, now that we've implemented the details in the controller below, we can see that the next failure that we see is that it's failing because it's expecting that it should see the screencasts and it's not seeing the screencasts. Well, the reason is because we created a empty view template. So even though the controller action's happening and it's getting all of the screencasts and it's exposing all of those screencasts to the view layer, that view template just is not doing anything with those at this moment. So we need to go and we need to modify that view template to actually do something with the screencasts which were exposed to it. So we can do that by doing a for each loop of each of the screencasts, like so, in our herb file. So there's our for each loop, and then inside of that, let's just do something as simple as a div with the name of the current screencast being included in the body of the div. So now if we go back to our feature file and we run the test again, hopefully if we didn't mess anything up, we would see it pass, but it looks like we messed something up. What did we mess up? It says undefined method each for nil class. Okay, so let's go back and look at our index action. I did it again. It's because I left off the S of the collection of screencasts. Let's go back to our feature file, run our tests again. Now we should see it succeed. Nope, we still have a failure. What is it this time? So this time it's undefined local variable or method scene-cast. Again, a typo. So if we go back to our index, it's complaining that here scene task, which should be screencast, is a typo. So if we go back to our feature file, run our tests again. We should see it pass, and it does. All right, so just for a quick recap, we ran into the point at which we were diving into implementation of the controller, and because we delved down into a new depth of the stack, we needed to then go and implement tests for that level of the stack. And it happens that RSpec is the tool to implement controller level tests, model level tests, lib level tests, and basically everything below Cucumber level tests. So we went down into our spec file, and we implemented the get all screencast test. We implemented the assigns the obtained screencast to an instance variable test, and it renders the index view template. We made all of these pass by implementing the actual code, which is right here. And then after we did that, we bounced back up to our feature file and we ran our tests again, saw that we were a little bit further in our tests, but we weren't quite finished. And then we used our finishing of our tests to drive out the view layer of our feature to actually make sure that we get a list of our screencasts. And that's it. See you next time.